In the spring of 1743, on the northern edge of the Blackdown Hills in Devon, there stood a timber-framed house known locally as Hawthorne Row. It was not marked on any official parish map, though it appeared faintly on a hand-drawn estate ledger dated 1709, where it was sketched as a narrow rectangle beside a crooked line meant to represent the River Otter. The house had been built some time before the reign of Queen Anne, and by 1743 it belonged to Edmund Hale, a man whose name survives only because of what was found after the fire. The fire itself occurred on the night of June 17, 1743, during a heat storm that rolled in from the Channel without warning. Parish records from Ottery St. Mary note unseasonable thunder and great disturbance of air, while a marginal note written in different ink reads simply, "House burned near the hills, no bells rung." The omission was unusual. Church bells were rung for far lesser calamities, even for livestock deaths. Yet for this fire there was silence. Hawthorne Row burned almost completely. Neighbors later claimed the flames had been blue at their base, an observation dismissed by the coroner as superstition, though he recorded it anyway. When the remains were inspected 2 days later, Edmund Hale was not found among the ashes. No body was recovered. No belongings identifiable as his remained intact, save for one object that would not burn. It was a leather-bound journal, wrapped in oilcloth and wedged beneath a fallen beam near what had once been the hearth. The journal was handed over to the parish clerk, Thomas Larran, whose careful handwriting appears in most Ottery records between 1731 and 1758. In his inventory ledger, dated June 20th, 1743, he wrote, "One book, personal, written in a small and strained hand, smells of pitch and damp, to be held pending instruction." There is no further instruction recorded. The journal itself begins without ceremony, no title, no dedication. The first page is stained dark along one edge, as if soaked in something that was not water. March 4th, 1741. The house has begun to remember things I did not teach it. At first glance, the entries resemble those of a solitary country gentleman, observations of weather, notes on repairs, occasional references to livestock, but threaded through these mundane remarks is a growing unease, expressed in language that becomes increasingly strained as the months pass. The walls answer at night, not with sound, but with insistence. I wake knowing something has been moved, though all remains as before. In April 1741, Hale records the arrival of a parcel delivered by a rider bearing no crest. Inside, according to the journal, were loose papers written in Latin and Middle French, brittle with age. He claims they had been copied from a manuscript older than the house itself, describing a method of attention rather than a prayer or summoning. Hale was careful to insist he did not believe in sorcery. He wrote that the documents were instructions for observation only, and that observation once begun could not be undone. By September 1741, his handwriting grows erratic, ink blots appear mid-word, several pages have been scratched out violently, the vellum nearly torn through. One entry is followed by a sheet pasted over the original text, though faint words can still be seen beneath when held to light. A later hand, possibly Lerin's, has written in the margin, illegible without damage. "I have begun to hear the third footstep," Hale writes on October 2nd, 1741. "It follows the other two, but never quite matches their pace. When I stop, it does not." Local folklore from Devon speaks of the extra walker, a presence said to accompany those who have lingered too long in lonely places. These tales were common enough, but Hale treats the phenomenon not as myth, but as consequence. In January 1742, Hale notes that the mirrors in the house had begun to fog even in the cold, reflecting shapes he could not see directly. He writes that the reflections lagged, as if reluctant to imitate him. "The glass is learning," he writes. "It watches more than it shows." The journal makes several references to older occupants of the land, predating even Norman records. Hale copied fragments of a map onto one page, now missing, showing circles marked with unfamiliar symbols. In the parish tithe book of 1698, Hawthorne Row's plot is left blank, bordered by a note, "Soil unreliable." In January 1742, Hale reports an incident involving a neighbor, Margaret Tews, who had come to complain of lights seen in his windows after midnight. He writes that she refused to enter the house, standing at the threshold and crossing herself repeatedly. 2 weeks later, Margaret Tews died suddenly. The cause is listed as apoplexy, but a separate burial note records that her eyes would not close. By November 1742, Hale no longer leaves the house. His entries are written entirely indoors, often by firelight, though he complains that the flames behave incorrectly, leaning away from certain corners. He mentions that the house has developed a pulse, felt most clearly in the floorboards near the hearth. "It does not want warmth," he writes, "it wants acknowledgement." The final months of the journal grow increasingly fragmented. Dates are missing or repeated. Some entries appear to have been written backward, the impressions visible on preceding pages. Hale begins addressing the house directly, apologizing, bargaining, promising to stop. "I did not mean to finish the circle," he writes in what is likely February 1743. "I only wished to see how it began." The penultimate entry is dated June 16, 1743, the night before the fire. "There is a sound now like breath drawn through timber. The walls lean inward when I am still. I believe the house is no longer content to remember. It wants to be remembered." The final page contains no date. "If the fire comes, it will not be punishment. It will be an opening." There are scorch marks along the bottom of this page, but the words remain legible. What happened next can only be inferred. No witness saw Edmund Hale leave Hawthorne Row. No remains were identified as his. Yet the coroner's report, dated June 21, 1743, includes a strange addendum. Ash patterns suggest movement after collapse, cause undetermined. The journal disappears from official record after 1743, but fragments resurface sporadically. In 1761, a London antiquarian named Samuel Wraith mentions a singular Devon manuscript, fire-touched, which resists summary. His personal letters describe reading it by candlelight and feeling observed by the margins. Wraith died later that year after falling down the stairs of his study. The manuscript was not found among his effects. In 1824, a partial transcription appears in a private collection catalogued under Domestic Curiosities, attributed only to E.H. The catalogue notes that the original was returned to its place of origin out of respect. The land where Hawthorne Row once stood remains undeveloped. Modern surveys show inconsistent readings, with ground-penetrating radar revealing voids that do not correspond to known structures. Locals still report that snow melts there first, and that footsteps sometimes appear leading toward the old foundation stones, but never away. The journal, or what remains of it, is rumored to exist still. A conservation report from 1938 references a fire-damaged book sealed in waxed cloth, marked "Not for Exhibition." The archivist who signed the report later crossed out his own name. No official explanation has ever been offered for Edmund Hale's disappearance. The fire is listed as accidental. The journal is described, when mentioned at all, as the ramblings of a reclusive man undone by solitude. Yet the final line, written in a hand that does not quite match the rest, appears in the margin of the last surviving page, squeezed between burn scars and soot. The house was never empty, and no record exists of who wrote it.